Tonight, let's settle in and spend some time with the history of LGBTQ plus community centres. Welcome back to Queer History for Sleep. Before we begin, if you enjoy cozy bedtime stories and LGBTQ plus history, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe. And if you enjoy tonight's story, I'll be back tomorrow night with the next episode in this series. Every episode on this channel is carefully researched, and you'll find the full source list for tonight's episode in the description below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. There is something so particular about walking through a door and feeling, for the first time, that you belong somewhere. Not just that you're welcome, not just that no one is going to ask you to leave, but that the space itself was built with you in mind. That the people who poured the foundation and hung the shelves and taped up the flyers were thinking, even then, of someone like you walking in one day. Think about what that means for a moment. Someone built this room with you in mind. Before they knew your name, before they knew your face, or your story, or the particular shape of what you were carrying when you walked in. They built it anyway, because they knew, because they had been that person themselves, maybe, or had known that person. And they understood that a room like this needed to exist. That feeling, that specific, quiet relief, is what tonight's story is about. It's not a loud feeling. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives gently, somewhere in the chest, as you're standing in a doorway and looking at a bulletin board covered in handwritten notices, or sitting in a folding chair in a circle with people you've never met before, or accepting a cup of coffee from someone who says your name like they've been expecting you. It's the feeling of being known, or the feeling that being known is, at last, possible. Tonight's story is about LGBTQ plus community centres, how they came to exist, what it cost to build them, what they held, and what they sheltered, and what they made possible, and what it means that they're still here. But to understand what community centres are, we first have to understand what came before them. We have to go back and sit for a while in the world that made them necessary. We have to go back to a time when there was almost nothing. Let's begin in the early 1950s. Let's begin with the quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. Not the quiet of a house settling at the end of a long day, or the quiet of a library on a winter afternoon. The enforced kind. The kind that descends when people learn, very early and very thoroughly, that certain things cannot be said. Certain feelings cannot be acknowledged. Certain lives cannot be lived in the open. It's the quiet of careful self-monitoring, of scanning a room before you speak, of choosing every word with a precision that becomes, after years of practice, automatic. So practiced that you do it without thinking, without even noticing anymore that you're doing it. The censorship is interior now, running quietly beneath the surface of every conversation, every social interaction, every workplace relationship. In the United States, in the years after World War II, LGBTQ plus people, though that language didn't exist yet, that vocabulary of community and identity was still being assembled word by word, existed under a regime of extraordinary pressure. It wasn't just social disapproval, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't just the raised eyebrow, or the whispered conversation, or the cold shoulder at the church social. It was something more systematic than that. something with the full weight of the government behind it. The late 1940s and early 1950s were the years of the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy was at the height of his influence, holding televised hearings in which people were publicly accused, reputations were destroyed, careers were ended. And folded inside that larger fear was a smaller and more intimate fear, one that historians later named the Lavender Scare. The logic of the Lavender Scare was this: gay men and lesbians were, by their very nature, security risks. They had secrets. They lived hidden lives, and that hiddenness made them vulnerable to blackmail. There's a particular cruelty in this logic that's worth sitting with for a moment. The argument was, essentially, because we are persecuting you, you are dangerous. Because we have made your life something that can be taken away, you cannot be trusted. The persecution was being used to justify more persecution. Between 1947 and 1950, this paranoia produced concrete, devastating results. 1,700 federal job applications were denied. Over 4,000 people were discharged from the military. Each one of those numbers is a person. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from living inside a performance, not the exhaustion of hard physical work. This exhaustion is different. It is the exhaustion of sustained vigilance, of never being off, of monitoring every word, every gesture, every expression of enthusiasm or feeling. People who lived this way developed a particular acuity. They got very good at reading rooms, at sensing the temperature of a social situation, at knowing who was safe and who wasn't, at decoding signals and subtext. Many of them developed senses of humor that operated on multiple levels, jokes that said one thing to one listener and something else to another. Think about what that costs. Over a lifetime. Monday morning, you take the bus to work. You arrive at the office. Your co-workers are talking about what they did over the weekend. You assemble your contribution to the conversation. A movie you saw, dinner with a friend, a walk in the park. You have learned to make the true things serve double duty. At lunch, you eat with a colleague you've worked beside for 3 years. He asks about your family. Where did you grow up? Are you seeing anyone? The third question requires the slight recalibration, the practiced reach for the answer that is not quite a lie. I'm not seeing anyone right now. Things have been busy with work. On Friday night, you might go to the bar. If you go, you plan it. You arrive, and the door opens, and you go in, and for 3 or 4 hours, you are somewhere else entirely. You go home after. It's late, and you go to sleep, and on Monday morning, you get on the bus, and go to work, and the performance begins again. This is a life, a real life, fully lived by a real person, a life full of love and friendship and work and pleasures and the ordinary satisfactions of ordinary days, and also a life lived under a pressure that was entirely unnecessary, that had been constructed by the society around this person and imposed on them from the outside. And something else gave the machinery of persecution a kind of scientific legitimacy. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association published the first edition of its diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. And in that manual, homosexuality appeared. It was classified as a sociopathic personality disturbance, not just deviant. Sociopathic, disordered, something that had gone wrong in a person's psychology. Conversion therapy was not only legal, but encouraged. Electroshock treatments were performed, aversion therapies, long series of sessions with psychiatrists, whose job, as they understood it, was to make the patient stop being what they were. This classification would not be removed from the DSM until 1973. More than 20 years later, an entire generation of people grew up with this in the air. This official pronouncement that their love was a sickness.
Where did people go? They went to bars. Not because bars were safe, often they weren't, but because bars were the closest thing available. A bar was a space that was at least nominally private. It had walls. It had a door that closed. Inside those walls, for a few hours on a Friday or Saturday night, a person could relax slightly, could talk to other people who understood what the week had been, could maybe dance, could be, for a little while, something closer to themselves. The discovery of a bar, for many people, was the first evidence that there were others, that the thing you had believed was entirely solitary and entirely yours was in fact something that existed in other people too. The bar proved it. You walked in, and there were 50, or 100, or 200 other people, and the evidence was undeniable. You were not alone. But bars came with their own complications. The biggest structural problem, at least in New York, was the New York State Liquor Authority. The SLA had broad authority to revoke the licenses of establishments it deemed disorderly. And the mere presence of gay people was, in the eyes of the authority, a form of disorder. This regulatory structure pushed LGBTQ plus nightlife underground. And underground meant into the hands of organized crime. The mafia understood very well that there was a market here. People who had nowhere else to go, who couldn't easily complain to authorities about unsafe conditions or unfair treatment. The mob could charge whatever it wanted. And if you had a problem with it, where were you going to go? Who were you going to call? The mob had established arrangements with local police, cash payments, sometimes called gaiola, that kept the raids infrequent and predictable. A bar run by organized crime that bribed the police, or nothing. Those were the options that the laws and policies of the United States of America had produced for LGBTQ plus people in the middle of the 20th century. Not through indifference, through active, deliberate policy.
In 1959, in Los Angeles, there was a small donut shop called Cooper Doughnuts. It sat on South Main Street, in a neighborhood that was a meeting point for several different communities on the margins of the city. Cooper Doughnuts was open around the clock and drew people who were out at all hours: gay men, transgender women, drag queens, sex workers. One night in May of 1959, police entered and began their usual work. They tried to arrest several patrons. But that night, the people inside didn't comply. They fought back. They threw coffee cups and trash and food. A crowd gathered in the street outside. The police, outnumbered and apparently taken aback by the resistance, retreated. The Cooper Doughnuts riot is one of the earliest recorded instances of LGBTQ plus collective resistance in American history. It happened 10 years before Stonewall. 7 years later, in 1966, two different events illustrated two very different approaches to resistance. The first was strategic. In New York City, members of the Mattachine Society organized what they called a sit-in on April 21st, 1966. A group of Mattachine members walked into a bar called Julius in Greenwich Village. They brought journalists with them. They walked in and announced to the bartender We are homosexuals. We are orderly, and we are asking to be served. The bartender covered the glass, refused to pour. The Mattachine members had their evidence, and it led eventually to a ruling that bars could not legally refuse service to gay patrons simply for being gay. The second event happened that same year, in August of 1966, in San Francisco, at a cafeteria called Compton's in the Tenderloin district. Police arrived and attempted to arrest a drag queen inside the cafeteria, and she, instead of complying, threw her coffee in an officer's face. And then the whole cafeteria erupted. Dishes were thrown. Windows were smashed. The Compton's cafeteria riot was one of the first recorded instances of collective transgender resistance in American history. The Daughters of Bilitis, founded in San Francisco in 1955 by Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, was the first social and political organization for lesbians in the United States. They published a newsletter called The Ladder. Beginning in 1956, The Ladder went out to its subscribers every month. Think about what it meant to receive The Ladder in the mail in 1958 or 1960 or 1962, living somewhere where the possibility of finding other people like you was slim. Your life, reflected back, your experience, named, your community, documented. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon would remain together for more than 50 years. In 2008, they became the first same-sex couple to be legally married in San Francisco. Del Martin died later that year at 87. Phyllis Lyon died in 2020 at 95.
The Stonewall Inn sat at 51 and 53 Christopher Street, in the part of Manhattan's West Village where the streets go slightly off the grid, where the old Dutch farm paths under the city push the avenues at angles to each other, and the blocks become small and labyrinthine and full of character. The Stonewall Inn had occupied its two adjoined buildings on Christopher Street for a couple of years. From the outside, you might not have been entirely sure what it was. The front windows were painted black from the inside, so you couldn't see in from the street. Inside, the conditions were genuinely terrible. There were no fire exits. There was no running water behind the bar. The glasses were dipped in standing tubs of water that grew progressively grimier as the night wore on. The toilets overflowed regularly, and people went there anyway, because it was one of a small number of places where you could be. On the night of Friday, June 27th, 1969, the bar was crowded. It was summer. And earlier that day, something else had happened. Judy Garland had died 5 days earlier, on June 22nd. Her funeral had been that day. 20,000 people had walked past her coffin in the hours before the funeral. Her death, and the day of her funeral, hung over the village that Friday night. At 1:20 in the morning, Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine arrived with officers. This was a raid. But something was different about this one. There was no tip-off. The standard advance warning hadn't come. Outside on Christopher Street, people had begun to gather. A crowd assembled. Somewhere between 500 and 600 people, spilling out across the narrow sidewalk and into the street. And then an officer struck a person in drag with a club. The mood shifted. It shifted fast. The crowd began throwing things. Pennies first, the gayola, thrown back at the police. There was an entire message in that gesture, in those coins flying through the summer air. Here is your money. We know what you've been doing with it. Here it is back. then beer bottles, then bricks. Someone threw a parking meter. The officers retreated inside the bar and barricaded themselves in. A riot squad was called in. The tactical patrol force advanced down Christopher Street in their standard formation, tight and disciplined, and the crowd responded by forming a can-can line and kicking their heels at the advancing officers. There is something about that image that contains an entire philosophy. People facing a riot squad and responding by forming a chorus line. The refusal to be made afraid. The insistence on camp, on spectacle, on humour as a form of defiance. The fighting lasted into the early morning hours. And then, the following night, people came back. And the night after that. The riots lasted several nights. What he had gotten was refusal. After years of compliance, a crowd of 500 to 600 people on a summer night in Greenwich Village simply refused. And the world didn't end. The police backed down. And everyone who was there understood something new, something they hadn't quite known before that night. This was possible.
Within weeks of the riots, 2 new organizations had formed in New York City. The Gay Liberation Front declared that gay liberation was connected to all other liberation struggles. The GLF was explicitly political in the broadest sense. It allied itself with the Black Panthers. It opposed the Vietnam War. The Gay Activists Alliance, formed a few months after the GLF, concentrated more specifically on gay and lesbian civil rights. The GAA pioneered a tactic they called a ZAP. Highly theatrical, highly public confrontations with politicians and public figures who opposed gay rights. GAA members showed up at public events. They asked loud, pointed questions. They made it impossible to pretend that gay people weren't there. The GAA also established a physical home, a firehouse they purchased and renovated in Soho, which they called the Firehouse. It was, in some ways, an early version of what community centres would become. A space where the community could gather, where meetings happened and dances happened and conversations happened and the work got done. The firehouse burned. A fire destroyed it in 1974. But the organising had been real, and the relationships had been real, and those things survived. And then, on June 28, 1970, exactly 1 year after the Stonewall raids, something happened that had never happened before, anywhere in the world. People marched, in New York City, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Chicago. On the same day, in multiple cities, people walked down public streets in the daylight, holding signs that said who they were, that said they were proud. In 1970, it was small. It was brave in a way that's hard to fully appreciate now. These were people walking down a public street, in daylight, putting their names and faces to something that the government was still, in various ways, persecuting. They could be photographed. They could be identified. They marched anyway. In New York, the march went up 6th Avenue, from the Village to Central Park. Thousands came. People who had been in the Village that night in June of 1969, and people who hadn't been there, and people who had heard about it and understood that something had happened and that they wanted to be part of what came next. The march moved through the city, visible, undeniable, saying by its existence, "We are here," what the community needed, what was becoming increasingly clear through the early 1970s. was somewhere to go on an ordinary Tuesday, a Wednesday afternoon, a Thursday night when you needed to talk to someone, and there wasn't a march happening, and the bars didn't open until 9. What the community needed was a room. It's a Tuesday afternoon, the mid-1980s. Let's say it's autumn, October, the light coming through the windows at that particular slanted angle that October light has, warm and a little melancholy at the same time. You walk up to a building. It might be a former storefront. It might be a converted house on a residential block. It might be a rented floor of an office building downtown. There's a door, and beside the door, or just inside it, there's a bulletin board. The bulletin boards of those community centres. They are layered, absolutely layered. Flyers for support groups. A coming out group on Monday nights. A group for parents of gay and lesbian children on Wednesday afternoons. A group for people dealing with grief on the first and third Thursdays. Housing listings, handwritten on index cards. A room available in a shared apartment, $225 a month. Call this number. Ask for Dennis. A notice for a community meeting. An announcement for a talent show fundraiser. A lost cat. Orange tabby. Answers to the name Brenda. The bulletin board is a newspaper. It is a social network. It is a record of what the community needs and what the community has to offer. You pass the bulletin board and you come to the front desk. The person at the front desk knows almost everyone. They know the rhythms of the space. They know which of the regulars is going through something hard right now. They know the new faces, the first-time visitors, because those faces have a particular look. When they see that expression, the one that says, "I found this address somewhere. I'm not sure I'm in the right place. I'm not sure I'm brave enough to be here." They say, "Come on in." Just that. No fuss. No dramatic welcome. Come on in. As if it is the most ordinary thing in the world, which it should be. And so here it is being treated that way. There's a counselling room, a youth group, a library, a small one, a bookshelf or two. The books on those shelves were donated by the community, one by one, over the years. Novels that include gay or lesbian characters, without making that the source of tragedy. Poetry, political histories, memoirs, medical guides and legal guides and guides to safer sex. The practical information that was genuinely hard to find in a public library in 1985. And the novels. The novels that the community centre library holds are not just entertainment. They are evidence. Evidence that people like the person reading them have existed before, have loved, have struggled, have found each other, have built lives. There is a kitchen, always a kitchen. Someone is making coffee right now. 2 volunteers are talking near the counter about the fundraiser coming up in 2 weeks. The kitchen is where things happen, informally. The official meetings are in the rooms with the folding chairs. But the kitchen is where people stay, after the meetings, lingering over their coffee, not quite ready to go back out into the night yet. A community centre exists for no other purpose than to serve the community. It doesn't need you to buy anything. It doesn't need you to be a particular age, or look a particular way, or know the right people. It exists to be useful, to be present. A community centre is the place you go when you need help, and you don't know exactly what kind of help you need. In New York City, the centre, The LGBT Community Center was founded in 1983. By 1983, the AIDS crisis was not a looming threat. It was already here. It had already taken lives, and the federal government had already demonstrated, with unmistakable clarity, that it did not intend to respond with urgency. In that context, a group of people decided to open a community center in the West Village of Manhattan. They found a building, a former school building on West 13th Street, a few blocks from the Hudson River. The people who founded the center understood that they were working against time. The crisis was not waiting for them to get organized. The community needed what they were trying to build now, not eventually. And so they opened. With what they had, volunteers trained to answer phones, counselors who donated hours, donated furniture, donated everything, really. The building needed work. Things got fixed as money came in, or as someone turned up who knew how to fix them. This is how these institutions are built. Not from a completed plan, but incrementally, problem by problem, need by need. By 2025, the center was serving nearly 2,300 direct service clients and welcoming more than 7,300 community event participants annually. But the numbers are only the shadow of the thing. The thing itself is a particular person, at a particular moment, walking in and finding something they needed. And in Chicago, there's another story. In 1973, a man named Michael Bergeron launched something he called Helpline. It was almost exactly what it sounds like. A phone line, a number you could call, and someone would answer. This sounds simple. In 1973, in Chicago, it was not simple. It was, in fact, quite extraordinary. If you were gay or lesbian in 1973 and you were in crisis, your options were limited. You could call a general crisis line, where the counselor on the other end might pathologize your sexuality as part of the crisis itself. Or you could call Helpline, and someone who understood would pick up. That difference between a voice that heard you and responded with pathology, and a voice that heard you and responded with recognition, was not a small thing. In 1973, in Chicago, it might have been a life-saving thing. Michael Bergeron incorporated the organization the following year as Gay Horizons. They found space at a building called Beckman House, at 3,519.5 North Halsted Street. 3,519.5. That address, with its extra half, suggests something specific. The kind of tucked-away space that organizations operating on tight budgets tended to occupy. A half address is a space that wasn't designed to be a front door. But Gay Horizons made it their front door anyway, and people found their way to it. By 1985, Gay Horizons had grown enough that a particular problem had become visible. The executive director, Bruce Koff, noticed something financially devastating. Mainstream foundations were explicitly, sometimes in writing, refusing to fund organizations that had the word gay in their names. Bruce Koff made a pragmatic decision. He rebranded. Gay Horizons became Horizons Community Services. The mission didn't change. The staff didn't change. The programs didn't change. The community was the same community. The need was the same need. But the name changed. And it worked. Now, we have to spend some time with the hardest years. The 1980s. By the early part of that decade, the LGBTQ+ plus community had built, from almost nothing, a network of organizations and businesses and social spaces that constituted something like an infrastructure. There were bars and bookstores and newspapers and magazines. There were political organizations and legal advocacy groups and health clinics and community centers. And then AIDS arrived. The Centers for Disease Control published its first report on the syndrome in June of 1981. A cluster of unusual pneumonia cases in young gay men in Los Angeles. 5 cases. A clinical report in a bulletin that most people outside the medical community would never read. The federal government was silent, not simply slow to respond, actively resistant. The Reagan administration essentially did not acknowledge that AIDS existed as a public health emergency requiring a federal response. The Surgeon General understood the magnitude of what was happening and wanted to act. He was blocked by administration officials who feared that any frank public health response to AIDS would require acknowledging the sexuality of the people most affected. President Reagan did not give a speech specifically addressing the AIDS crisis until 1987. By then, more than 20,000 Americans had died. People were dying. The government looked away, and so the community took care of itself. This is not a metaphor. This is not an abstraction. Gay men and lesbians and transgender people and their allies built, from the ground up, a system of care. They drove people to the hospital. They sat with the dying. They coordinated meals. They cleaned apartments. They walked dogs. They handled the paperwork when someone died without a will. The community found lawyers who would help, or learn to navigate the system themselves. They answered the phones. They kept answering the phones. The support groups held a particular kind of grief, layered and ongoing. Not the grief of a single loss, but cumulative grief. The loss of one friend, and then another, and then the person who had been your support through those losses, and then another. In some cases, entire friendship networks were lost over the span of a few years. Many of the volunteers who were doing this work in the 1980s were driving people they had known for years, and all of them were doing it while also grieving, while also afraid, while also exhausted. They showed up anyway. This is one of the most important sentences in this story. They showed up anyway. The LGBTQ plus community's response to the AIDS crisis is one of the most extraordinary examples of community self-care in American history. In the absence of federal support, in the face of active governmental abandonment, in the middle of social stigma and political indifference, people built a system of care that was responsive, creative, compassionate, and genuinely effective. They built it with what they had. They built it while they were sick and grieving and afraid. They built it in converted storefronts and half addresses with donated furniture and folding chairs and mismatched mugs, with volunteer labor and small donations and the stubborn, furious, loving insistence that this community deserved care. The community centers of the 1980s lost many of the people who built them. And they kept going, kept running, kept answering the phone, kept making the coffee, kept opening the door. In 1994, a new kind of organization was founded, Centerlink, the community of LGBT centers. Its premise was simple and significant. The individual community centers that had grown up across the country were doing similar work, facing similar challenges, and had been doing it largely in isolation from one another. What if they were connected? What if they could share what they had learned? What if a new centre opening in a smaller city could benefit from the experience of centres that had been operating for 15 years? Centrelink was the answer to those questions. A national organisation, eventually a global one, that would connect the individual centres, help them share knowledge and resources, and represent their collective interests. By the middle of the 2020s, Centrelink had more than 350 member centres. It is the world's largest association of LGBTQ plus centres. In 2007, something happened in Chicago that was, in its way, a kind of declaration. The centre on Halsted opened. Not a converted storefront, not a rented floor of an office building, not a half address tucked in beside something else. A building. 185,000 square feet, custom designed, purpose-built, for the work of an LGBTQ plus community centre. It had a gymnasium, a theatre, a real one, with a stage and seating, a rooftop garden, a technology centre, multiple meeting rooms of various sizes, a commercial kitchen, a cafe, dedicated space for social services, dedicated space for youth programs, dedicated space for senior programs, and it had a LEED Silver certification. LEED certification means this building was designed to last. You don't put the effort into LEED certification for a building you're planning to use for 10 or 15 years and then vacate. LEED certification is an investment in the long term. It means we expect this building to be here, doing this work, for generations. When the centre on Halsted opened in 2007, with its LEED Silver certification and its 185,000 square feet, it was saying something very clear. We are here, not temporarily, not provisionally, not until someone makes us leave. We are a permanent fixture of this city and this neighbourhood, and we have built an institution that will be here for generations. Coming from a community that had, within living memory, been raided and harassed and pushed underground, that had operated out of half addresses and donated space. That statement was enormous. And the centre on Halsted sits on Halsted Street, in the neighbourhood where Gay Horizons had begun its work decades earlier with a phone line and a half address. The institution had grown up in the same neighbourhood where it began. It had put its roots down and grown into something that could hold itself up. In New York City, the centre on West 13th Street became home to something that carries its own particular weight, the LGBT Community Centre, National History Archive. This is where the community keeps its memory, not the formal, official history, the community's own memory, the letters people wrote to each other before email, the diaries, the photographs, the organisational records, the personal papers of people who built things and organised things and fought things and lost people and kept going. The posters from the demonstrations, the flyers from the dances, the programmes from the theatrical productions, the t-shirts, the flags. For so long, LGBTQ plus history was not kept, not in the official archives, not in the museums and libraries that the broader culture trusted with its memory. LGBTQ plus history was often lost, or hidden, or destroyed. People burned letters, destroyed diaries. The evidence of who they were was dangerous to have. The archive is an act of determination against that pattern. The determination that this time, the things worth remembering will be kept. That future historians will have what they need. And there's one more story from Chicago that I want to tell you. In the city's uptown neighborhood, on the north side of the city, there is a building called the Town Hall Apartments. It is a residential building, 79 units of affordable senior housing. The apartments are for LGBTQ plus seniors. For people who grew up before Stonewall, who were young in the 1950s and 1960s, who lived through the Lavender Scare and the military discharges and the psychiatric classifications and the police raids, who lived through the AIDS years, who are now old, into their 60s and 70s and 80s, and who need housing that is safe and affirming, housing where they don't have to perform the alternate self again, because that is a real thing that happens. LGBTQ plus seniors in traditional assisted living facilities sometimes go back into the closet. A person who has been out for 30 or 40 years, who built a life and a community and an identity in the open, goes back to performing the alternate self in order to be housed and safe. The town hall apartments exist, so that doesn't have to happen. The town hall apartments sit on the site of a former police precinct. Sit with that for a moment. The building where the harm was planned and organized and administered, where officers were dispatched to conduct the raids, where the arrested were brought, processed, humiliated. That building is now a home for the people who survived, for the people who lived through the raids and the discharges and the classifications and the Lavender Scare and the AIDS years and everything that came before and after, who are still here, who are growing old. They are living now, some of them, in the very building where the machinery of their persecution once operated. The physical address of the harm is now the physical address of a home. Let me tell you who is walking into a community centre today. According to a 2024 report from MAP, the Movement Advancement Project, and Centrelink, LGBTQ+ community centres collectively serve more than 3 million people every year. In any given week, 58,700 people receive some kind of direct service from a community centre. 3 million people a year. From a phone line in 1973, from a half address in Chicago, from a converted school building in the West Village in 1983, to 3 million people a year. 2/3 of centres provide health or mental health services directly, without a referral. Walk in and get care. Nearly every community centre in the country is involved in healthcare. 92% of centres are engaged in advocacy and civic engagement. More than half conduct voter registration. Community centres are registering voters. 32% of direct service clients are under 23 years old. 42% are transgender or gender non-conforming. 68% are people of colour. These numbers tell you something about who needs these services, most urgently. Young people who are still figuring out where they fit. Transgender people who face particular challenges in accessing healthcare and housing and employment without discrimination. People of colour who navigate the intersection of multiple forms of marginalisation. 63% of total staff are people of colour. 20% of total staff are transgender. And 24% of executive directors are transgender. We have to be honest about the difficulty of the current moment. 73% of community centres reported anti-LGBTQ+ threats or harassment in the past 2 years. more than 7 in 10 community centres, across different sizes, different cities, different regions, reported receiving threats or experiencing harassment. This is not a statistic from a distant era. This is now. This is the buildings that exist today. The front desk volunteers who are sitting at their desks today. The young people who are taking those long bus rides to get to a Thursday youth group meeting today. They are doing it in the context of threats. The people who staff and volunteer at community centres are going to work in buildings that have received threats. They are sitting at front desks, facilitating support groups, running youth programs, answering phones. And they know that there are people out there who have sent messages, making clear that they are opposed to what the centre is doing. They stay. They keep the door open. They go to work. More than a third of community centres have shifted their primary strategic focus to resisting anti-transgender legislation. Centres are providing the healthcare that the legislative restrictions are trying to limit. They are saying, with their presence and their programs and their open doors, a counter message: you are welcome here. Energy spent on legislative advocacy is energy not spent on direct services. The centres are trying to do all of it, serve 3 million people a year, while simultaneously fighting a legislative wave that threatens the basic conditions under which that service can be provided. And they know, from experience, from the Lavender Scare years and the AIDS years and every difficult stretch before and between, that the moment when conditions are difficult is exactly the moment when the work matters most. The door being open matters more when there are people threatening to close it. We are coming to the end of tonight's story. We started in the 1950s, in the enforced quiet, in the years when the United States government was discharging people from the military for who they were, and the American Psychiatric Association was classifying who they were as a sociopathic personality disturbance. We've travelled through all of it. The spontaneous eruptions, Cooper Donuts in 1959, Compton's Cafeteria in 1966, the strategic actions, the sip-in, the ladder published month after month, the explosion of Stonewall on a summer night in June of 1969, a crowd of 500 to 600 people on Christopher Street deciding that compliance was, on this particular night, no longer acceptable, throwing pennies back at the police, forming a can-can line in front of the riot squad, the specific, extraordinary, defiant joy of people who had had enough, the building, the slow, patient, crucial, unglamorous work of actually building the infrastructure that a community needs to survive. Michael Bergeron, in 1973, starting a phone line, a number you could call. Someone would answer. The centre in New York City, in 1983, opening its doors in a former school building on West 13th Street. The AIDS years, the terrible years, the years that took so many people and asked more of the institutions that served them than anyone should be asked to give. The phone hotlines, staffed by volunteers who were also afraid. The support groups that held cumulative grief, week after week. The volunteer drivers and the meal coordinators and the people who sat with the dying. The community's response to the AIDS crisis was one of the great acts of collective care in American history, not recognized as such at the time, but real and sustained and effective and extraordinary. Centrelink, in 1994, connecting the network. The centre on Halstead opening in 2007, 185,000 square feet, purpose-built, LEED Silver certified, a statement of permanence that would have seemed impossible to imagine in 1973. The LGBT Community Centre, National History Archive on West 13th Street, keeping the community's memory. The Town Hall Apartments in Chicago's Uptown neighborhood, 79 units of affordable senior housing for LGBTQ plus elders, built on the site of a former police precinct. And today, 3 million people a year. Centres receiving threats and harassment and staying open. Centres fighting anti-transgender legislation and still running the programs and still answering the phones. I think about the person who walks in for the first time, not sure what they're looking for, not sure they're in the right place. And then, one day, they go in. They find the bulletin board, the handwritten notices, the index cards, the layered accumulation of what the community needs and what the community has to offer. They find the front desk, and the person at the front desk looks up and says, "Come on in," as if it's the most ordinary thing in the world. These institutions were not built by extraordinary people doing extraordinary things, in the sense of being born extraordinary. They were built by ordinary people who saw something that needed doing and decided to do it. People who answered phones and made coffee and taped up flyers and drove people to the hospital and sat with the grieving and showed up and showed up and showed up. The building is never just a building. The door is never just a door. And the room inside, with its folding chairs and its coffee smell and its bulletin board and its mismatched mugs and its collection of donated books and its circle of people who have come here from across the city on a Thursday night. That room is a kind of miracle. Come on in. The door is open. The room is warm. Someone at the front desk knows your name, or will learn it. The coffee is ready. The chairs are in a circle. You're in the right place. You are not alone. You never were. You never have to be again. Thank you for listening. If you found tonight's story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Queer History for Sleep. I'll be back tomorrow night. Until then, rest well.